They said, you're not allowed to mention drugs. I said, we're not telling kids to take drugs.
Basically, I was reading the newspaper and hearing about this terrible famine that was going on.
I'm going to put this in and see what you think. And if you hate it, then I'm doing my job.
Comics are generally about people in tight-fitting clothing fighting one another. Can people that occupied with fistfights and spandex deal with the issues of the day? Why the hell not?
The idea of superheroes having a real-world effect is an interesting question. You know, it's not just comic books that of which you could ask that question. You can ask that of any literary text or any piece of art. What are the political consequences of literature that tackles social problems or that tries to provide some context for understanding to its readers about real-world issues? If comic book superheroes can't leap off the pages, they can at least provide what I'd call a virtual resolution of certain kinds of real-world problems.
You can't just randomly do shit and expect that nobody's going to be affected. Oh, yes, I can write and draw anything I want, and after all, since it has no effect on anybody, then it doesn't matter. Well, guess what? It does. It has an effect on people. Could be good, could be bad. What do you want it to be?
The responsibility of a writer could be summed up in 3 words: do no harm. I think if you're a popular writer, or a popular movie director, or actor, or lecturer, or politician, or whatever, the things you say and do are going to influence people.
This is very relevant stuff. We're not writing how to cook books, or we're not writing blockbuster movies intended for producers and visual effects. We're actually writing about our times and our people, what it's like to live here, what our people dream about, and what we're struggling through just to get from day to day.
I don't know what the impact is of these books. It would be easy of me to say that nobody in their generation is able to be a judge of that stuff, that that's the kind of thing that future generations will have to judge, but that's the easy answer. I mean, I think the bigger reality is, you know, we're just out here trying to tell stories.
There was one story I did in Thor years ago. It was a time when there were hippies all over the place. I had Thor come down to Earth, and he's in a soda fountain, and he meets some teenagers, and he's talking to them, and he's giving them a lecture. And he's saying, you know, it's understandable if you're dissatisfied with a lot of things about the way the world is today, but it won't do any good to drop out. The thing to do is plunge in, make it better, fix things. I got 1 million letters from readers who loved it and said they were showing it to their brother and their friends and their parents and blah, blah, blah. And that made me feel really good.
The 1960s was a time of change worldwide. Everyone and everything was a battleground for social awareness. And comic books were a huge part of that scene.
In the late 60s, a group of friends of mine and I decided that it would be very wonderful to do an underground comic on ecology and aim it at a really young audience and give them kind of some direction and some sense about the outrageous things that were going on in the environment. And we called it Slow Death Funnies. We had just landed on the moon in '69, and the cover was this awful monster rising from the Earth. And in its hair were all these various corporate logos rising out of its hair. And it had one long, horrible, withered arm reaching out, and it was just touching the moon.
Last Gasp was really successful in choosing their arguments wisely. They decided to attack issues like environmentalism because nobody else was doing it at the time. And I think they really saw a need for somebody to speak out with these things.
In the early Slow Deaths, I had a Slow Death eco quiz. And one of the things we had researched was like how much farmland in California would be under asphalt in the next 20 years or so? And the answer was 50%. We have to remember that 1/3 of all vegetables in America are grown in this land. So you reduce that by 50%, where are your vegetables going to be coming from? Well, now we know it's called globalization. But this actually happened. I mean, I was so surprised that the predictions were true.
The Comics Code was run by a group of people who decided what could be published in a comic book. Or they did until they met comic legend Stan Lee. Stan was the first man to take on the Comics Code and win.
We weren't allowed to mention drugs or have stories involving drugs. But I had received a letter from the Office of Health, Education, and Welfare in Washington to the effect that Stan, being aware of the great influence that Marvel Comics has over the youth of America, we think it would be great if you would do a story warning the readers about the dangers of drug addiction, something of that sort. And I figured, why not?
Stan wrote this story where some kid is strung out on pills and falls off a building and Spider-Man catches him, and it's, the lesson is clearly, no one could possibly misunderstand this as other than a lesson that drugs are bad. So the Comics Code took one look at it and said, nope, using drugs, not approved.
I said, we're not telling kids to take drugs. We're doing this because a branch of the federal government wrote to us and asked us to do it. Sorry, you can't mention drugs. So I was so proud of my publisher. I walked into Martin Goodman, the publisher. I said, Martin, we got to put this book out without the seal. He said, you go ahead and do it, Stan.
Marvel, to their credit, said, screw it. We're going to back the play, and we're going to go after it, and we're going to publish this book without the Comics Code seal. And that opened up the doors for DC to do drug-oriented stuff and for other publishers to sort of push those boundaries a little bit, which in the 70s and stuff, it was great because this was an era where, America, no one can argue that America was having a gigantic paradigm shift in society in the late 60s and early 70s. And that comics were able to reflect that is great without the Comics Code Authority standing over them.
The 60s had changed things. Now people were questioning everything, including their heroes. Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams were two men who started dealing with serious issues on a regular basis in their pivotal Green Lantern, Green Arrow series.
Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams' collaboration on Green Lantern, Green Arrow in the early 70s was really groundbreaking for its time. It was the first comic that was socially relevant, dealt with overpopulation, dealt with drug addiction, dealt with poverty.
I honestly didn't know what Denny was up to. He knew that I wanted to do this, and he knew that I wanted to create a conflict between the characters. They're talking about their ideologies, and suddenly this old black guy steps forward and he says, I know who you are, and I know that you helped these people with orange skin on this other planet and these purple people on this other planet. Have you ever helped anybody black on Earth? And Green Lantern hangs his head.
We never wanted to present people with answers to problems. We wanted to wake people up, maybe. I thought I was late 20s, early 30s. By now, it's probably too late for me. My mind has become too rigid for me to think of real creative solutions to these problems. But if I can get a really smart 12-year-old and have him grow up thinking about this, maybe he'll come up with answers.
That type of reading when I was younger showed me there is a way to marry the fantastic to things that are important to people or relevant to what's actually happening. So I'd say that in some way they definitely had a big effect on me. I know that, just so that everybody's clear on this, I know going back to reread them now, I find them somewhat heavy-handed and maybe overwritten. But I know that for my 13, 14, 15-year-old mind, they were absolutely perfect.
The Batman book, Seduction of the Gun, actually helped push through a gun control bill in the state of Virginia. The story broke headlines with its depiction of gangland gun runners buying weapons in Virginia and bringing them back to Gotham City, which was clearly standing in as New York City. Why are the Teen Titans not telling runaways to go home? And how can a comic book feed starving people? After Green Lantern and Green Arrow's more mature approach, comics were forced to grow up a little, and there was no turning back. Dealing with issues wasn't as simple as the good guys win, the bad guys lose, and home is a safe place to be.
I earned my way through college writing comics, but I studied to be an artist and a teacher. And I was, in fact, a junior high school teacher for 1 year and then fled back into full-time comic books. I couldn't stand it. But I've always had an interest in doing educational material in comics format. Through the National Runaway Society, we did a several-part story in the Titans about runaways. And one of the strange things there, in going to several of the runaway houses in New York to research it, was to find out that the first thing we had to do was not tell the kids to go home, because very often, more than you'd believe, they were running away from a really horrendous situation. They weren't just running away because they thought it was cool. Life at home was not acceptable, and running away was better. So what we talked about was how to find the runaway groups, how to avoid being taken up by the prostitution or the other things, but how to get counseling, how to go through that method rather than the standard at the time, which is go home, because that's not an alternative for those kids. And that was a surprise to me, which I never would have found out about had we not spoken to the people at the places themselves.
Stan Lee wasn't the only creator to take on drug awareness. Marv Wolfman used the Teen Titans to take on the issue. But due to copyright problems, their leader, Robin, could not appear in the episode and had to be temporarily replaced by a character known as the Protector. Bob Geldof was behind the music event of the 1980s, Live Aid, raising millions for famine relief in Africa. The comic book world had its own man with a plan, and he got some of the biggest names in comics involved.
Basically, I was reading the newspaper and hearing about this terrible famine that was going on. The rock stars were making money at it, and I thought, you know, we have a fan base. Maybe we can do something like that. We approached Marvel, I believe it was, to start off with, and we did one book for them. Getting it together was kind of interesting because we knew we wanted to get as many people in on it as possible so that their names could help sell the book. We got over to DC and started doing it. The printers donated their profits. We got everybody down the line to do that. The feedback from those books was pretty good. We did make some money. Both of them made about $500,000 each.
Superheroes can be inspirational. They can inspire us to do things. For instance, about worldwide hunger, it's such a huge problem and I feel bad about it, but what can I do? To see a superhero handle it in his own way and provide some resolution to the problem in the pages of the comic book may really, in the real world, have the effect of inspiring the audience to seek out some kind of resolution on their own.
In the 1990s, Grant Morrison made DC's little-known character Animal Man a hit. He used this success to put a spotlight on the issue of animal rights.
Grant Morrison decided to take a character that wasn't really well known and make him socially responsible and environmentally responsible. So he takes this character called Animal Man and sort of starts to stick up for animal rights. And I think Grant Morrison just saw an area in the comic book marketplace that needed fulfilling, and maybe it was something that he was a little bit concerned about as well.
At the time of Animal Man, I was a serious, kind of, well, not a serious animal rights activist, because we know what those guys do, but I was an animal rights kind of, I would go along to the meetings. I was part of the Animal Liberation Front in the day before it became illegal, and it was a big thing to me. I was a vegetarian as well, so I felt as if I wanted to use the comic to put across some of those points, but at the same time the comic also taught me not to be so dogmatic, because a lot of the ideas that you have when you're young are just big ideas, you know. Things are a lot more complex than that. A lot of people say things like, all those horrible experimenters, they're so awful, I hope they come back as animals and suffer themselves. And I'm thinking, well, how do you know all the animals that you're ready to torture them aren't previous generations? I mean, that's such a stupid way to look at it. So I was kind of trying to get to the heart of that a bit, and also I changed my own mind in the process of talking about it. In the case of something like We 3, where you see animals, well, animals are violent. Any of you ever watch your cat? Cats are hardwired to kill when they see birds and mice. When they see movement, something comes on in their heads that they cannot control themselves, they have to kill. So I had to deal with that in We 3. Again, you're writing a book about animals, but I thought, no, I'm not going to make them cuddly animals. I don't want this to be sentimental. I want this to be about animals as they actually are. And if you gave a cat a battle suit and threw a soldier at it, the cat would tear the soldier apart, and that's what would happen. But at the same time, I wanted people to be sympathetic to these animals because they'd been used, they'd been exploited, and those natural traits had been perverted. There's a genuine attempt to use the work to say something or to deal with something, and hopefully I'm not just a bizarre, solitary character. I think the things that I feel are kind of universal, so hopefully other people will be able to latch on to it.
One of the most famous Iron Man comics that dealt with the very real problem of alcoholism was titled Demon in a Bottle. The cover showed Tony Stark, Iron Man's alter ego, suffering the effects of the disease. We've heard all about superheroes, but what does the alternative press have to say about comic books and social issues? And Martin Luther King has a comic book? Homelessness, racism, famine. There are dozens of issues comic books have taken on. Here's the essential reading on social issues in comics. This is Comics 101. The Other Side by Jason Aaron and Cameron Stewart. The hard-hitting examination of the Vietnam War and its effects on the people who fought it and the civilians at home. The Other Side approaches the war from the American and Vietnamese point of view in an attempt to give a full picture of the conflict. Pedro and Me is the story of Judd Winnick's friendship with Pedro, a man who is HIV positive. Pedro and Me follows the relationship of these two men from their meeting on the set of the MTV show Real Life through the course of Pedro's fight with AIDS, showing the effect the disease had on Pedro and those closest to him. Sentences. The Life of M.F. Grimm is the autobiographical story of rapper M.F. Grimm, also known as Percy Carey, and his career as a gangster rapper. Grimm's career takes a horrifying turn as he loses the use of his legs through gang violence, an incident which causes him to take a new outlook on life and what it's all about. You want to talk about social change? The book is Martin Luther King, and the author is Ho Che Anderson.
One of the earliest interesting biographies in comics is Ho Che Anderson's biography of Martin Luther King.
It came to be because Gary Groth, who is the publisher at Fantagraphics, said to me, dude, I want to do like a series of historical books. And I've been thinking for a number of years that I'd like to start off the line with Martin Luther King. And as I've said 1,000 times, me being one of the few black cartoonists out there, I guess he sort of figured that I'd be like the right guy for the job. Didn't really have the qualifications or the skill really to do it at that point. Especially strange given that, you know, the book I'd done previous was a porno book. Kind of a leap, but he saw something in me and decided to give me the gig.
He relies very heavily on the actual words that King said, many of them fortunately recorded for history by illegal wiretaps. And it's a fascinating portrait of the man, not a exclusively flattering portrait of the man.
The idea behind the book was not to deify King, but to kind of present to some extent him as kind of a real guy. I wasn't trying to take anything away from him, but I thought it was more interesting to kind of present some of his faults along with some of his triumphs. The idea was to try to comment on the times through the man to some extent. At the time, it was pretty well received. The only really negative thing we had was the King estate coming up to us and saying, please cease and desist. We no longer want this book out there. And I was expecting a whole big legal battle to come from that, but surprisingly, nothing more ever materialized.
This is a work of art that involves as much of Ho and himself as an artist as it does, you know, just telling the story of Martin Luther King.
It's not right for me to just come along and just treat it willy-nilly. You have to treat it with a certain reverence, I believe, you know? I mean, that sense of reverence can't ultimately affect how you do it. When it actually came time to draw it, I just let that stuff go and just sat down and did the work that I needed to do and trusted that I'd put enough preparation into it to make it work.
Two of the biggest names in alternative comics are Jaime and Gilbert Hernandez. The characters they've created in Love and Rockets, like the artists themselves, are never afraid to deal with the issues of the day.
When I was younger, those socially aware comics like the Green Lantern, Green Arrow ones about heroin and race and things like that were kind of interesting and kind of fun. But at some same time, there was underground comics that were doing that stuff without preaching to you.
Here's a big problem with tackling serious issues in superhero comics, in a Batman comic or a Superman comic. There are sensitive writers and people who are very interested in breaking taboos, but what happens is when you finish reading that story, it's a Batman story.
It's almost an insult, you know, when you have superheroes trying to help the homeless. You know, you're insulting the homeless.
Something like Love and Rockets, even though we're dealing with fictional characters, you can still sense that it's based in the real world.
Doing about Mexicans living in Southern California was really easy because that just wasn't being done. Back then, it was an open canvas, you know, it was a blank canvas. I mean, you could put out whatever you want, and it was new to a lot of people in comics. I'm gonna make these two characters lesbian, you know, just like that, you know, and I got a response, you know, right away.
Handling situations like having gay characters, having troubles in Love and Rockets, we will try to deal with them as they happen in real life, as much as we can.
As long as I treated it fairly or as truthfully as I could, to the best of my ability, I didn't have to apologize for anything. That's the good thing about alternative comics. It draws a lot of creators that want to tell a personal story, whether it's social or whether it's political, whether, you know, without the hand being dropped down on them.
The comic book has to provide a satisfying resolution to a problem in the pages for the person who's reading it to feel empowered enough to seek a real-world resolution.
Comic books of the 50s reflected the Cold War. Comics of the 60s reflected the social change of the times. And if you were to pick up a comic book today, you might be surprised how much of the world you recognize in its pages.